At the very highest level, up here, I guess, the practice of establishing and maintaining boundaries is a kind of art form, and it can make you more compassionate. My name is Pablo Das. I am trained as a Buddhist teacher and as a holistic wellness coach. I work with people around the resolution of trauma and recovery from addiction. My website is causesofwellbeing.com. And today I want to talk about boundaries. The practice of setting boundaries is a way of establishing and enforcing limits on other people's unacceptable treatment and behavior. It's also a way of protecting your time, your energy, and your attention. Now, I just spent a week kind of laboring over an article that I will post on my website, and I imagine I'll have a link, in the usual places for that. And I mention that because it turns out that the practice, if you start to really think deeply about it, is kind of a layered thing, and I don't have enough time to cover all of the points, but I'd like to make a few points for this video. Thing number one is this. As a person who has a background in a contemplative-oriented practice in Buddhism, I like to make the point that boundaries begin almost as a mindfulness practice, that they begin with a practice of drawing your attention inward and attuning to your own internal experience as you move through life, as you navigate your relationships, and particularly to the sense of liking and disliking things. In every experience that we have, there is this sort of internal sense of a yes and a no. And for people who have poor boundaries, we have to begin there, that you have to learn to not only draw your attention inward, but not to abandon yourself when things are going on. To actually to stay sort of rooted and paying attention particularly to the sense of liking and disliking things, and to honor that sense. That's really important. So point number one, it begins as a practice of being kind of anchored in your own internal experience to the experience of the kind of yes and no that we all feel as we're navigating the world in various situations, and to honor it rather than overriding it. People who have poor boundaries are often very much attuned to everybody else. We are often people who come from probably early life situations where for us to be safe, it was important for us to make sure that everybody else was okay. We got into the experience of kind of the practice of manipulating other people's experiences, making sure people are okay for us then to be okay. And we forget that actually in healthy adult life, we should probably flip that, and that we should start by being attuned to our own sense of safety and comfort and the kind of internal yes and no, and to lean into it. So that's point number one. Point number two, boundaries can be either expressed or unexpressed. So if you're in a relationship with somebody where there's some conflict, maybe you're in some kind of process, and you're with somebody who is reflective, who is open to process, who is not going to be immediately defensive, who is willing to take feedback and go through a thing and then turn around and kind of honor your experience and affirm it, and maybe there's some give and take. And if you can enter into a process like that with somebody, I'd almost make the argument that it's your responsibility to communicate those boundaries and to communicate what you like and dislike and what you need. And because if you don't do that, you're actually robbing people in a way of the possibility of getting it right. And so many of us didn't have that early on in life. We didn't have a social situation. We didn't have primary caregivers or people in our environment who would listen to us and who would affirm our experience and commit to making some changes to support us to feel safer or more comfortable or whatever. So if you have those kinds of relationships with people that are in fact reflective and who have some sense of emotional awareness, then those are the kind of relationships that you want to have these kind of processes with. And for those people, you probably will feel closer to them in the end. So that's one thing. Now, we're talking about expressed or unexpressed boundaries. For people who are not reflective, who have not done any real work on themselves, who aren't open to feedback or criticism or a process, for those people, it may be better for you not to engage in communicating your boundaries, but rather just to sort of establish those boundaries within yourself and just operate from them. I'm thinking of an example of somebody I have in my life who, I would love to have over for dinner in the company of good friends. And because of some of the kind of the dynamics in our relationship, they're not a person that I'm going to go, spend a weekend in Vegas with one-on-one. So that's an kind of uncommunicated boundary that I have with somebody who I can keep in my life, and I just have them at the appropriate sort of distance. They are in the appropriate place in our relationship. Now, if you're, navigating conflict with somebody who's truly an abuser, I would argue that it could even be dangerous to communicate boundaries. You just have to set them and hope for the best. Maybe slowly back away, right? And I know I'm making light of that. There are situations where people are in abusive relationships where their survival depends on establishing some kind of boundary, getting out of there, disappearing, seeking protection, whatever. And that could be very rocky. But here's the point. Sometimes it's appropriate to communicate our boundaries, and other times it's totally appropriate not to communicate them at all, just to set them within yourself and then operate from them, kind of live from them. So that's point number 2. Now, earlier I said that boundaries are kind of an art form, and we should be very firm with our boundaries, especially in the beginning. If you come in as somebody who is has poor boundaries, there's going to be a kind of learning curve. There's going to be an arc, because it's very difficult to have boundaries with people because we fear the consequences. We fear people may push back. We love and want the people often that we have boundaries with to be in our lives. It's quite difficult. So here's the other side of the coin, the art form, the kind of push and pull that I want to try to communicate, that is the kind of art and the nuance of setting boundaries, is don't be punitive. Boundaries should be compassionate. They should represent the appropriate consequences for someone's actions, but there is a meaningful difference between hurting someone back, getting back at somebody, and allowing a person to experience the appropriate consequences of their actions. It is a kind of core, spiritual principle in my life not to do harm. So when people transgress against me, I try to honor and be mindful of the difference between being punitive, punishing, and taking self-protective action and allowing people, I would even argue compassionately, to experience the appropriate consequences of their actions. And there's a bit of a push and pull in an art form there. Compassion is the difference. And here's what I mean by that. I've been around the world a while now. It seems to be true that people transgress against us. People hurt us. We hurt one another, because sometimes it's you who does the hurting. We hurt one another largely out of our own pain and suffering. And a wise, compassionate response will acknowledge that most people don't get up in the morning and say, how can I harm people? But I live by a certain phrase that I've heard in spiritual and particularly Buddhist circles all of my adult life, and I've really taken it to heart, and it's this. We are not our responsibility, but we are, sorry, I said it wrong. This video is going well, so I'm not going to throw it away. I'm going to try to save it. We are not our fault, but we are our responsibility. So the things that happen to us probably early in life, the shitty parenting, the neglect, the abuse, being a member of a marginalized community, the traumas, all of the things, right? All of the things that happen to us that are not preferable, that didn't support us to feel secure and safe and to trust people, to trust the world, all those things. Those things that happen to us and the impacts they have on our brain and our body and our nervous system are not our fault. Okay? Any compassionate person would appreciate that. However, this is the and. Your suffering, my suffering, is never an excuse to cause harm. It's never a justification. So one of the hard kind of parts of the art form of this that I've had to take on in my life is to accept that suffering is not equally distributed in the world. Some people have it harder than others. I try to do my best, and that'll be my last point. I try to do my best to accommodate people without being punitive, without being punishing. And I've learned not to shield people, and that, in fact, that I don't do people a favor by shielding them from the appropriate consequences of their actions. Not punishing them, not hurting them back, but allowing people to experience the appropriate consequences of their actions, even if it's me who is sort of enforcing those consequences. So this is very difficult, because as I said, we often love the people, we want the people in our lives who we're setting boundaries against. And hopefully the boundaries are an impetus for them to take responsibility and do their work. My policy is if people are suffering and they're doing their work diligently, the work they are responsible for, then I have a lot more willingness to work with them, even if they are causing a little bit of harm. If people are suffering and their suffering is spilling over onto me and they are not doing their work, that's usually when I cut people out of my life. That's when I have some, or at least have some much firmer boundaries. Here's the last point, because the video is getting a little long. Last thing I want to say. Let the development in this part of your life, the development of boundaries, the growth in your life in this direction, let it make you more forgiving. The world is full of people right now who are in the business of punishing people, calling people out, the righteous, you know what I mean. There is too much of that in the world, in my opinion. There's something that happens as we become more secure in the practice of boundary setting. We overcome a kind of sense of lack of control, of helplessness, of even victimhood, which allows us then, later in the process, to start to allow people to be in process, to be imperfect, to fuck up once in a while, without us jumping in to punish them. I have had enough of people being called out and held responsible for the worst moment of their lives and never seeing that we all have angels and demons within us. That we are all capable of really terrible shit. Now, of course, we have to be judicious. I'm not handing anybody a free pass to hurt other people without consequence. I spent the whole first half of this talking about firm consequences. But over time, as you become more stable, as you feel you have more control over what you expose your psyche to, who you give your heart and mind to, who you let in and who you put out of your life, there's a way in which I hope it makes you more forgiving. That you can let people be imperfect, to be in process, to be human without punishment. Because there's too much of that going on. So that's what I have to say. If you're interested in one-on-one support, my website is Causes of Wellbeing. There's a coaching drop-down. And if you want to see an article where I go into more details, you can go to my website, Causes of Wellbeing. There's a writing link, and I'll have the article posted there, and I'll post a link to it here. And finally, if you would subscribe to this channel, I'm really early in this process, and it would be a indication that what I'm doing is of interest. So cheers, thanks, I'll see you next time. Bye.